This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. So there was one bit of news that to me kind of surprisingly went under the radar, and maybe this is why this bit of news is happening in the first place. But according to Tom Pelissero, OTAs might be over, or at least the off-season schedule as we think of it is going to be going through some major changes. Now, I'm going to read Tom's tweet thread from yesterday. He says, the end of OTAs. NFL's Players Association is working for a proposed overhaul to the offseason schedule starting as soon as 2025, eliminating voluntary on-field workouts in the spring in favor of longer training camp ramp-up, with players reporting in mid-June to early July per sources. He continues to add on here. The union has been seeking feedback on the plan from players, a majority of whom support the change. So according to Tom, the union is saying that a majority of players support the change. Sources say a formal proposal is expected this summer. Off-season workout rules are collectively bargained, and changes would require an agreement with the NFL. Under new leadership, the NFLPA has consulted the medical and performance experts in hopes of creating a common sense solution for reducing injuries and maximizing player recovery time. Virtual classrooms would still be permitted in the spring, but no practice until camp. That's an important one. I think a lot of people have missed in discussing this. Under new leadership, the NFLPA consulted medical and performance experts in the hopes of creating a common sense solution for the reduction of injury and maximizing player recovery time. Virtual classrooms work would still be permitted in the spring, but no practice until camp. It's different. Virtual classroom work. Wonder what that means. The NFLPA push for a revised offseason isn't directly tied to an 18-game season. However, it's worth noting that a longer season would furthermore shorten the time between the season and training camp. Another reason consolidating a player's time into one long break would make sense. So that is the initial tweet that Tom Pelissero put out there. And I think a lot of people's initial thoughts were, okay, well, is this going to make players more at risk for showing up out of shape? I personally don't have that concern. I don't think NFL players are going to be showing up out of shape. I think, and if anything, this actually makes it easier for players to be in shape. Tom came back and quote tweeted his own tweet saying, basically the idea here is to roll a extended OTA style ramp up, strength and conditioning, non-padded work, straight into training camp without a 6-week break / de-escalation in between. So a major change there. So basically what the NFLPA is proposing for its players and what the NFL is considering and what everybody is considering is moving the off-season training program into the ramp up for the beginning of the season. On first glance, I am a fan of this idea. The reason I'm a fan of this idea is I do think it's silly how we stretch out the offseason program. I don't think it benefits anybody. I don't think it makes anybody better. And I think whatever value you could extract from OTAs is lost. Also, it seems like when you listen closely to what's being reported, players are still going to be able to learn what they need to learn. It's just not going to be physically applied at practice on a football field. There's still going to be virtual classroom time, whatever that means. I wonder, too, if this means that they'll get to an easing of the rules between player and coach communication during a break. I know the NFLPA has been very strict on there being no contact between players and coaches, and that's been something that has caused friction with some players and coaches on, you know, what you can do and how difficult it makes a transition to be there. But yeah, on first glance, I'm not opposed to this idea. I think being able to roll the strength and conditioning program, roll the installation of an offense, and then roll that into applying it into physical padded practice sooner than just taking a 6-week break makes sense, because with this 6-week gap, from my perspective, as somebody who's been watching the offseason part of the Cleveland Browns very closely for the last 5 years and pretty much ever since I've been a fan of the team, so like my whole life, what I've noticed is you get OTAs. You get to a place at OTAs where you feel comfortable running 7-on-7s, and then you break. And then you come back for training camp and you basically do the last 2 weeks of OTAs over again so you can get back to practicing. If you can just cut out that wasted 8 weeks there, condense that into 6 weeks, let guys have full time off, come in and work out a full off-season program with their trainers, I think that would be overall better. Now, I do think current players aren't going to like it. And I think the reason for that is obvious. If you've been doing something, if your offseason has been scheduled a certain type of way for your whole career, you're not going to be a big fan of changing it, right? You're probably really used to running it one way. So I see why like guys like Shelby Harris gave this a thumbs down on Twitter. But ultimately, I think this is a good idea. There are some other thoughts on this. I did want to bring up some other thoughts and opinions on this. Bucky Brooks tweeted, interesting, though I see the value in OTA and minicamps. I never understood the current calendar. The 6-week break from the end of OTAs until training camp seems to diminish the gains of the offseason program. Guys are training on their own for over a month before jumping right into camp. Seems like a recipe for a bunch of soft tissue injuries and stuff, because you can't replicate the speed and intensity while working out on your own. Perhaps a change will make it easier to acclimate to camp and longer ramp ups for padded practices. Yeah, this basically, I agree with this take. I think that this is why they would want to make the move and why it makes sense for NFL players to want to make this move. Just doing all of that at once instead of just like shutting down for the end of the season, starting up in May for OTAs, voluntary OTAs, getting up to a point to where you're really practicing, and then shutting down again just to start up again in late July, just doesn't make that much sense to me. As far as how you would want a practice to go, like anywhere else where you have some kind of ramp up to the season, it's not structured like that. You know, college practices go all the way up to the spring game, and then they break, and then they come back in the summer and they ramp up again. There's no like intermediate period where you're also doing stuff like you're working out the whole time with the team and everything, but you just kind of ramp up all at one time. The NFL does this start-stop thing that I don't think is great. And also with the reduction of preseason games, I do think it is important that you get all of this work kind of in one period, because now you don't even have preseason games to really get guys prepared for it. The next guy who had a take on this, Shelby Harris, he gave this a thumbs down, 2 thumbs down. Again, I would expect veteran players, especially guys like Shelby Harris, to not be a fan of this, because you structure your life around the NFL offseason calendar when you work in football, especially when you play NFL football. And I imagine that this big of a change to the status quo is not a fun one to deal with for the current players. But that being said, I still do think that this is probably better for most players in the long run. I even think there's an interesting thing that could pop up here too. Trey Wingo says, what we are seeing in real time is the beginning of the negotiations for the new CBA. Current one runs out in March 2030. The NFL wants an 18-game regular season. Cool. The NFLPA opening gambit is more off time after an elongated season and the dance begins. I honestly think this doesn't have much to do with the 18-game season. Obviously, if you're moving to an 18-game season, this becomes something that you absolutely have to do. But I don't think this is exclusively about the 18-game season. I think this is just about, hey, it just doesn't make sense how we're doing this. And more players are skipping out on OTAs. So it's becoming a joke in itself. So why not just make this and put this somewhere in the calendar where it makes sense? Yeah, it could help with the 18-game season, but I don't think this is like a big opening salvo to a negotiation period for an 18-game season. I really don't think it's that deep. Jason from Over the Cap says, this sounds like something teams would be in favor of, veterans would be strongly against, and young players would be for. Some offseason scheduling may need to change with work, vacation, and for team personnel. I think it would make sense to push back free agency if no OTAs. So one thing that does get brought up a lot when people talk about this new switch is what will happen to rookie minicamp. Now, there's been no mention of what will happen to rookie minicamp, and because rookies don't really have great representation at these bargaining tables in the union, it's very likely that rookie minicamp will just happen after the draft like normal, and then they would have virtual classrooms like they mentioned to carry those rookies over. Another thing I've thought of too, because Jason from Over the Cap brings up moving around free agency. And I do think this is something to consider. Now, we know that the NFL season ends in February. Now, what has usually followed after the NFL season ends is free agency. And then after free agency, you get the draft. After the draft, you get voluntary OTAs. And then in June, you get mandatory OTAs. And then you get camp in late July. That's been the NFL calendar. But if we're going to condense all of this stuff and basically start OTA/camp in July, well, then we got some room to move some things around so they make a bit more sense. And I think moving some things around to make a bit more sense would benefit not just the NFL, but the entire ecosystem around pro football. So let's say the NFL does this. And let's say the NFL moves the draft to March, so that the draft is before free agency, because I think the draft should be before free agency. Every other major sports league, I believe, does their draft before free agency. It makes sense. Draft players, then sign guys who you didn't get to draft, right? There's so many free agents that get left in this weird limbo spot where they can't find a team and their value goes down because these guys are holding out hope that like somebody's going to fall to them at pick 54. It doesn't make sense to do things like that. The draft should be in March. Let's say you do the draft in early March, right? You roll that after the Super Bowl, early March, 2 weeks after the season ends, similar to how the NBA does it. You roll the draft out, right? Early March. Then you also have free agency after that draft, right? So March, April. And then you have the off period, May, June, and then you get camp in July. I think that makes a lot more sense and is actually better in the long run. Again, people who work in the NFL aren't going to be a fan of that changing. But I do think that would be better for fans. That would make more sense for teams. In the long run, that would be a better way to do things. And I think we'll think about how we did it now in like 10 years and be like, why did we do it like that? Another reason why I think that moving this calendar around in that way would be smart for the NFL and smart for the entire ecosystem of football is if you move the draft to March, you now can have spring football start March 30th, right? I think that's when the UFL started this year. Now, If you have the UFL starting March 30th, what you can do if there's an early March draft is take all the players who are recently undrafted, have them play in the UFL. Now, this depends on how nice the NFL wants to play with a spring league. The spring league's not a competitor. There's very good likelihood that the NFL wants to partner with the spring leagues and use the spring leagues kind of as a farm system for these NFL teams. And I've said it before, I'll continue to say it. I don't think spring football makes sense to be a farm system for the NFL in the same way that baseball and basketball do it. And how baseball and basketball do it is they have a minor league system playing a season concurrently with the fall season in order to develop players. The reason it doesn't make sense is I don't think NFL teams are going to want to have players they invested draft picks on playing football for teams that aren't them and potentially getting injured. So here's a way that the NFL can use the UFL as a farm system to get better quality players in the NFL in for camp, and maybe even get more popular players into camp to have more eyes on some of these preseason games. So you end the draft, you have the draft in March, early March. You start the UFL season March 30th. So if you are NFL draft hopeful and you did not get drafted and you didn't get picked up on your tryout for an NFL team, instead of sitting around for a year hoping you get picked up again and then playing spring football, what you can do is say, hey, I did not get drafted. I did not stick with the team that I had my rookie mini camp with. I'm going to take this offer to play for the UFL and try to play my way onto a roster spot. This way, the NFL gets more tape to evaluate more players. This way, the UFL gets more talent. In this way, the UFL and the NFL get more guys on the roster that should be there, which would benefit both leagues. Something to think about, right? I think this could be good for the entirety of the football ecosystem. Now, again, I don't think the NFL would be in it just to do good for the NFL, for the football community. I think the NFL would be in it because they would benefit. They would get better players in these camps, which would increase the quality of play of the product that they put out. And they would have players who, these games for the UFL, they're on national TV. So you would have guys who might be able to get a little bit of a fan base, and maybe you can sell the two preseason games where there's going to be no starters in there. You can sell the stars of that spring league playing who would just be getting off their season. It's something to think about. It's not it's not going to be a ton of money, but it's not going to be no money that could be gained from a beneficial partnership with the spring leagues. So I do think that that's something that can inadvertently benefit the entire ecosystem of football. But Pat McAfee also had an interesting take here. He said, so not an end to OTA, seemingly a readjustment of where they would be. They did something similar during COVID. I believe most of the guys loved it for their bodies and such going into training camp. So this is not like an unheard of idea. Remember, they didn't do OTAs during COVID, and this is something that players did speak positively of just kind of condensing it all in there. And the reason I think players would like it for their bodies is you get more consecutive time to just focus on getting healthy versus focusing on practicing and getting healthy, or focusing on flying from where you actually live to where your team plays to make sure you're there with their doctor, and it really messes up your rehab schedule. There's a reason why when guys are rehabbing, they usually have to be away from the team, because it just makes sense to be in their rehab environment versus trying to bounce around from being with the team to being where they're going to rehab. So I think this makes a ton of sense. This will probably be how things go. We know the NFL is going to push towards an 18-game regular season sooner than later, just because 17 games feels like a awkward, unfinished number. We know that they're going to go to 18 games eventually. We'll see how much further it goes. We'll see if this goes down. But yeah, a extended training camp period, but no OTAs. And I'm all for it, because the less I hear people complain about who shows up to a voluntary OTA, the better my life is going to be. Because if you've watched me for any period of time, you know that that is my absolute 100% least favorite talking point of all time, is getting mad about who did or did not show up to a voluntary workout. So if we just never have to deal with that again, I'm good with it. But I do think that this has some real benefits for NFL football players. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.